Welcome everyone. The Costume Society of America thanks you for joining our second Conversations on Dress web panel. I'm thrilled to welcome you and be your host today. My name is Monica Sklar and I'm the Vice President of Technology for the Costume Society of America. I manage the University of Georgia's Historic Clothing and Textiles collection, co-lead the CSA Digital Angels Preservation Program, and engage with undergraduate through PhD students and colleagues on fashion history scholarship. The topic for the panel today is diversity and inclusivity in clothing-related museum industries. For far too long, fashion exhibitions, clothing practices, and employment within clothing collections have centered around wealthy, able-bodied, mainstream Eurocentrism. As we know, this is not representative of the diverse communities and cultures that these museums exist within and around. This panel recognizes that we can all do better and expand the narrative and hopes to touch on these issues of inclusion from education, gatekeeping, collections management, curatorial issues, and employment. CSA's goal is to discuss some of these issues and examine some examples of good practices within the field. Without further ado, let's welcome our moderator for today, Elizabeth Way, who's an assistant curator of costume at the museum at FIT. She curated and co-curated several exhibitions, including Global Fashion Capitals and Black fashion designers, and her personal area of research focuses on the intersection of African American culture and fashion. She will introduce today's presenters.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to introduce our panel today. I'll start with Darnell Jamal Lisby. He is a fashion historian and curator working towards illuminating research around the impact of the Afro diaspora and Blackness within the history of fashion. Recent projects include helping to curate the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum Willie Smith Street Couture exhibition and edit the exhibition book, curatorial projects at the museum at FIT and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and publications for Cultured Magazine, Teen Vogue, and the Fashion and Race database. Our next panelist is Susan Neal, who is the exhibitions planning director at the Field Museum in Chicago, where she programs the museum's temporary exhibition galleries, supervises the outbound traveling exhibitions program, develops collaborative projects with other institutions, and works with leadership to plan permanent exhibition projects. Her previous positions include the curator of Textiles and Social History and vice president of collections and exhibitions at the Atlanta History Center and Hope B. McCormick Costume Fellow at the Chicago History Museum. Georgina Ripley is Senior Curator of Modern and Contemporary Fashion and Textiles at the National Museum Scotland in Edinburgh. She curated the international touring exhibition Body Beautiful, Diversity on the Catwalk, exploring the representation of race, disability, gender, size, and age across the fashion industry. And her current research explores the intersectional approaches to constructs of masculinity in contemporary menswear and image making. Our last speaker, certainly not least, is Sarah J. Rogers. She is the director of the Kent State University Museum. She has over 25 years of curatorial and museum management experience in the visual arts, performing arts, and science center arenas, curating over 30 exhibitions and authoring over 20 exhibition publications. She was one of the founding curators of the Wexner Center for the Arts, Columbus, and held leadership positions at COSI Science Center and CAPA, Columbus Association for the Performing Arts. So without further ado, I'll welcome our panelists and get started on the first question. So I'm going to direct each of these questions to a specific speaker, but when they share their views, we'll invite any other speaker who would like to comment on the question to jump in as well. So I think, are we all here? Or yes, great. So our first question is for Sarah. As a director, what role do you think museums should play in advancing inclusivity and inclusivity culturally?
Thank you. And I'd also like to start by just thanking our hosts and CSA for convening this really critical conversation. It's not a new conversation, it's not a need, but it's certainly, since especially the murder of Mr. Floyd, urgent. And this urgency, well, unfortunately, sometimes it takes society, the urgency, to break the logjam. I think kinds of conversations will get us closer to where we need to be. So what I want to try to do is frame the edges of how I and some of my colleagues that I talk to look at the edges of this issue. I'm going to refer to some details related to Kent State University Museum. I think many of you know us, have probably borrowed works from our collection, studied it, but if you don't, we're an interesting example in that we're a state university in the middle, we're not the middle, but we're called the Midwest, but in Ohio, northeastern Ohio. We are a fairly, it's 25,000 students. We're fairly considered liberal campus among a very rural, conservative community, and yet northeastern Ohio is a very culturally liberal entity, and all that plays into our audiences and how we think about things. But I think I keep looking at the micro and the macrocosms of these needs. And for me, where it starts is squaring things up. We have these missions, so you need to square with your mission, which is usually filled with lots of words that maybe were pulled together years and years ago, but what do they mean today? Because if those aren't squared with the needs in your community, and then connecting to, in relevant ways, to your communities that you serve. And by that, I mean the communities that are adjacent, physically as well as emotionally adjacent to you, regional, national, global, and then virtual. And for us, that is a student body, which is right now, this year, over 35% of these students are first generation college attendees. And so when I first arrived here, again, after, the 30 years, many of you know Jean Druzado, who was our fantastic director for many years, and Anne Bissonnette. Now we have curator Sarah Hume, established this incredible program with what is always talked about as a jewel of a collection. But what does that really mean in terms of what's going on today? And so started looking at how do we be more open and porous and relevant? Well, I started talking about with people the fact that museums are not neutral. 20 years ago, I would not have said that. And by not being neutral, I'm not talking about being Republican or Democrat, but I am talking about there are politics, whether it's racism, economic instability that we're seeing in the fashion industry, that we're seeing in our economies. Those issues are what matter to our communities. And if museums don't become a place to convene conversations, sometimes when I'm talking to folks who are new to museums, say, I want you to use this like you use a library. Like, that is the goal, is like, and to do that, and to be conveners of conversation, you have to establish trust. And to be to do that, you have to be honest about who you've been, what you have in your collections, and how you've presented them. And I think that kind of opening up is the first layer. And if any of you read Betsy Bradley's article in August this year, she's director of the Museum of Mississippi in this country, and it was a very heartfelt, what did she said, really questioning what value we have. She grew up, like many of us did in the field, going to museums. This is part of our vocabulary and who we are and part of our experience. But are we reaching those people that live alongside of us in our communities? Again, either adjacent or virtually. And if we're not, should we be open? If we're not, what are we doing? What opportunities are we wasting? So for Kent State University, that is finding a way, and for us, it's been literally going out into the community, and sometimes one by one, and saying, okay, yeah, we may look like a mausoleum on the outside, but when you come inside, and inviting people in, here is what you'll find. And then start to have the conversation. And, you know, museums are based on a colonial model, and we collect and capture sometimes, you know, with all good intentions, and my colleagues will speak to that have much more sort of really diverse, different collections. But essentially, we've brought it's a collection of objects, oftentimes separating them from their context, again, often with good intention. And then we've kind of had certain gatekeepers that we'll talk about in a minute, you know, sort of telling us about those. So to start by being honest about our collections, how they're organized, that's a big question. You know, why are you categorizing everything that is non-European as, you know, sort of lumped in one category, and who is talking about it? And perhaps one of the most important changes is this bringing in other voices, which has slowly been happening over recent years in museums. But for us here, that is experts in the field, but also it is inviting in those graduate students, those first generation students, to come in and have a powerful conversation. Because the objects we have, these clothing, these material culture, examples of material culture, they can help us find answers to how we can be that leadership going forward. And there will be many answers, but they need to come from different kinds of voices. So how do our actions reflect that?
Thank you. That's really interesting, especially to hear from a director of some of the issues that how you position a museum within the community. Would anyone else like to add on to this idea of the role of museums in promoting inclusivity?
I would like to touch on that as well. I hope, can everyone hear me clearly? Because I was going through some like computer tech difficulties, but anyways, I will say that like personally in my journey into this field, like the idea of working in a museum was not something of an extension, just along the lines of just general museum studies, was not an extension in my own personal community. There are certain things that were, you know, I guess for lack of better terms, idolized, like being a lawyer or a doctor. I grew up in the DMV, so like politics is like or government contractor is pretty much like the end all be all. So the idea of working specifically for a museum doesn't really prove itself, I guess, financially beneficial as well. I mean, that's also like a part of a larger conversation about like how institutions, and there are systems of, there are different systems that don't allow for much financial mobility. And for African Americans in the Black community, where we're already disproportionately situated within the scope of the United States, I will say that, you know, working at a museum which has been advertised as not necessarily the most lucrative isn't going to be appealing to a lot of young people. You know, I grew up where a lot of my friends wanted to be basketball players or rappers, or that because that's where they saw a way out of, you know, getting out of their own financial struggles that they were going through. So within that context in itself, you know, the idea of working in a museum, I don't feel like museums in general have reached out, you know, consistently to marginalized communities and represented their stories or allowed those in those communities to tell their own stories. And I think that is just like a motley of issues that have kind of put us at this helm that we're in, this intersection that we're in, where we're trying to relearn a lot of these different institutions and how we can do better going forward.
Thank you so much. Georgina, do you have something to add?
Actually, just around that, I think there's an element, and Sarah's already touched on it, about, and as has Darnell, about making your workforces diversifying your workforce as it is. And I think one role in that, and that kind of is an extension from what Darnell's just said, is this kind of need to make opportunities for mentoring and employment in museums more democratic as well. And I think this is a really interesting time during this pandemic, as we're all kind of turning towards digital, and we don't have access to museums and archives and gallery spaces in the same way that we did, and we don't know what's coming next. I mean, certainly here in the UK, we've just had more restrictions announced for us. That we want to be looking at things like, how can we engage with like students, for example, who want to get experience working in museums remotely? So can we set up remote work placements? Can we find other ways in which museums can get that kind of foot in the door, or museums students can get that foot in the door, or early career practitioners or emerging curators can get that kind of experience without it having to be that old traditional system of doing unpaid internships or whatever. So that's just something that I think this kind of experience right now, where we're living our lives on screen, has maybe opened up new avenues for us to kind of consider how we do that.
Yeah, and I think the key of paying for student work, for internships, for networking in different networks, different connections, so that BIPOC students can reaching out and feeling they can be part of it. But if we're not paying the students, I think, Darnell, your point is a really good one. Then again, the museum hasn't been part of the experience because it hasn't been welcoming, so why would I even, and there's no money. So we do have this great opportunity to, like, I keep looking at what are the things we can change now, because there's so much. And that, and putting funds towards that kind of support for young professionals is one of the important places.
Thank you. I'm just going to quickly mention that if you only want to see the speaker's screens, you can change your settings at the top to the active cameras. And also, we'll be taking questions throughout the talk in the chat box that'll be collated at the end. So if anyone has questions during the course of the talk, please write them into the chat box. We're going to shift a little bit and talk a little bit about collections. So for Georgina, how diverse are the collections you work with, and what are your strategies for reinterpreting the objects that you already have to tell more diverse stories?
I think, going back to what Sarah said, you have to be honest about the collections that you have, and what you have or haven't done in the past. And I think we, like a lot of museums, have a lot of work to do in actually understanding how diverse our collections in fact may or may not be. I think there's work to be done in terms of reinterpreting and decolonizing collections, but also the same goes for how we understand fashion history. And that kind of refers back to your previous roundtable discussion. I kind of, as an example, Amelia Rouse's online lecture that was around Black bodies and neoclassical whiteness was really interesting. So for example, in our permanent fashion gallery, we have some dress from the neoclassical period on display, and it's in a case that looks at body image. So that's really tracing how silhouettes have changed over time and just focusing very much on the kind of underpinnings and those garments that were worn to encourage your body to conform to beauty ideals of a certain time. So our label around our neoclassical dress, for example, talks about this trend for emulating European statues. And that was this sort of vogue for the neoclassical whiteness. And what it does not mention at all is how loaded these kinds of trends were and how loaded these beauty ideals were. And that actually we know we now need to go and rewrite that label so that we can look at what this vogue for whiteness in that period actually was really referring to. So there's a lot that we need to do in terms of reinterpreting objects that we already have out on display. There's also, I think, an area for us to consider is that our dress and textile collection is split across my department, which is art and design, where we look at Western dress, and the Department of World Cultures. And while we recognize the need to work collaboratively internally, I think that sort of structure exacerbates what Jennifer Craik refers to as this European dictator model of fashion. And this idea sort of assumes this cultural superiority in the sense that we don't apply the term fashion to non-Western dress, which we have historically typified as unchanging and traditional. And so in so doing, we've disabled these other fashion systems that coexist and actually also interact with our own high fashion designer variant, because we so often have appropriated from them. So I think there's also work to be done around cultural appropriation, and that's not just in contemporary fashion, like where I think it's simpler in so much as it's talked about a lot. I think we also have to apply that to our historic collections, and that's slightly more difficult to do. And in that sense, I think what's really important is this idea again of consultation, collaboration, and working with other people. Like, I think the first step is recognizing whether or not you have the right voices in the room to even make changes or to alter interpretation. But there's also an assumption that we make that extant clothing in museum collections is so often elite dress, and so we think very much about ascribing it to a white wearer. And I think we need to change our kind of presumptions around who might have worn the dress in our collections. And in doing that, I think there's a value in having a greater understanding. Certainly in my case, being in the United Kingdom, I think we actually have quite a poor understanding of our own history, which recent works like David Olusoga's Black and British and Miranda Kaufman's Black Tudors have shown contributions by people of colour to British society since Roman times. And I think that fashion plays a huge role in elucidating kind of social histories and what's happening at certain times. And so I think we need to think more about how we interpret provenance of objects, and that also goes for production as well. So I mean, there's a lot of research that's been done around the role of enslaved people in the production of cotton, for example. Certainly in Scotland, we had thriving cotton mills in Renfrewshire and Lanarkshire, but I think we also need to go beyond that. And in a contemporary sense, that also means looking at, there's been lots of reports levied against the fashion industry recently around modern slavery. And that's not just, we often tend to think about that not happening in our own country, and that's actually also happening here. So there's a lot to consider around interpretation, telling stories. And I think the important thing, we're doing audits of displays, we're working with our learning and engagement team to create trails that start to unlock, this idea of this hidden history. But I think we need to really work hard on creating this sense of community ownership and being able to tell stories that people can have an emotional connection to and that they will be able to relate to. And we also have, we have a responsibility to facilitate accurate histories, tellings of accurate histories.
Thank you for that. I think in this moment when, loans and travel and things like that are a little less possible, it's actually an opportunity to look at what you already have and how you can reinterpret it and pull out fresh ideas. Would anyone else like to weigh in?
Georgina, thank you for that. I thought about, as you're talking about reinterpreting and changing labels, the potential for comparative, that adding the new label in proximity to the old label, and how whether that's viable for your particular situation, how that can help us to be transparent and indicate, perhaps in smaller ways and smaller steps, the bigger initiatives that we are either already embarking upon or are trying to move forward. I think sometimes, because museums have generally so much authority, that visitors from the dominant culture aren't necessarily thinking critically about what it is that we have put out there for them to learn or whatever as an object lesson there. And we as Sarah said earlier, we are we do have agendas. You know, we're not neutral. So why not be clear and upfront about that, and hopefully show that we are open to changing our stories and changing the way we work.
I agree, because I think one thing that museums are actually bad at is probably communicating what we are doing around these kinds of things. And so often that looks on the outside like we aren't doing anything, when in reality it means we move very slowly, and we have done traditionally, and we need to get better at that, but things are happening. So I think that would be, like what you say, it'd be really nice to be transparent about what we are trying to do. And then also invite feedback on that and hold ourselves accountable, and you know, be self-critical.
Yeah, I had, you know, an interesting conversation this week with one of our graduate students in the fashion school, and she's been working on thesis around luxury fashion designers in African American communities. And you know, I was talking to her about an issue we have, which is that we have very few late 20th century or even from mid 20th century examples of Black designers. And you know, I said, well, we've got, you know, the Stephen Burrows out, and she said, but nobody knows who Stephen Burrows is. She said, these Black kids don't know who Stephen Burrows is. She said, so we started talking about it's because that moment in time in the 70s, which is about, you know, why he was so important and what was going on with Black models and advertising and like the whole complexity. And so we started going back and forth. He's like, we have to understand what people don't know because we haven't been talking about it. And it's not just Black people or white people. We just, until recently, hasn't been out there. And so it led me to realize I've got to, you know, other than beyond just people have a common knowledge around certain designers, you know, well-known things. But if we're bringing these new narratives and we're inviting people to do it, we've got to be much more expansive than we have in the past.
I agree with that, because it's one of those things where, you know, I feel like there are, I know, am I breaking up? Am I lagging a little bit?
Your audio is coming in good.
Okay. What my situation where I see like different stories that are told, I feel that there can be a lot of nuance and a lot of fun that can be kind of seen through a lot of the educative initiatives that museums can do. You know, it doesn't have to be so stoic in the sense, like we can talk about, you know, the relationship between Tina Turner and Azadine Alaya. Like we don't necessarily have to negate everything that has been, you know, already established in our field, but we can also add and build on top of what was already established. So I think that, you know, we can kind of find new ways and different intersections and make the entire output when it comes to collections and exhibition and research a lot more digestible for audiences in terms of what they're really looking for right now. And also I feel that in terms of collecting, you know, it's always typically in a lot of cases, we collect based off of what exhibition is on, and then we'll do kind of like the acquisition process after, you know, the exhibition has been the exhibition has come and gone. And so through that, I feel that if the stories are truly, you know, speaking to a wide variety of different perspectives, then the collections will lend themselves to a different perspective. I mean, of course, there should be separate strategic plans that actually purposefully, you know, seek out those stories and don't negate those stories. But then the exhibitions are pretty much like a primary way that is how most museums, I think, operate at this point in time because of different kind of constraints. So.
Thank you so much for that. Darnell, we're going to stay with you. As a practitioner who is relatively recent in your MA graduation, can you speak a little bit about how you've been positioning yourself in the field and also the expectations you had at the beginning of your education versus now?
So the way I have been positioning myself in the field is it's kind of complicated, but not complicated. Because I don't want to say new graduate because it's been a little while since, but it's been difficult because there's just the reality of there aren't many curatorial jobs. So I'll back up with the second part of your question about the expectations. Of course, like growing up, well, in high school is when I pretty much decided that I wanted to go into becoming a fashion curator and telling stories through textiles, through dress. And I saw other curators do it, and I was like, well, I can do it too. And so as I was getting the education, whether it's bachelor's and then eventually the graduate program at FIT, for myself, I looked at, for instance, I went on the website and I saw, oh, these are all the careers that you can have, and these are all the institutions that their graduates have gone off to. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is like a space for me. There is a place for me that I can grow and learn and collaborate with other fashion history lovers. And then when you're in the program and you're doing, and even in undergrad, and you're doing all these internships, you begin to really kind of realize that this is like a very niche space within the whole art history realm. And then not only is it a niche space, there's a lot of us who are going through these programs and there's very few job opportunities at best. And then we're all going and applying for the same position. So I think that like that reality was not set when I started both the undergrad program and the graduate program. I'm a very just like real authentic kind of person, like tell me how it is so then I can make the decision for myself, because I didn't come, and I've also realized that even beyond fashion studies, the museum professions is almost like a rich man's game. Like a lot of my friends were supported by their families for years and years to get multiple degrees, to do different things in the field. They could go a year or two without getting a paid job because they had their families that support them. And my mom and I, we did the best that we could, and we're still doing the best we could. And I'm not going to stop doing the best that we can. And I thank her and I love her so much for being my rock and my support in this journey. But at the same time, we're not, Bill Gates around here where we can just be shelling out money where I can do unpaid internships all the time. And with that said, those kind of expectations should be set at the beginning so that students can really make a decision. If this is what you want, then this is what's going to happen. And this is going to be your trajectory based off of the experience that you may come from. I have a lot of young burgeoning like Black students that always contact me because I have other streams of like other platforms that I participate in. Like I have a podcast called Fashion Victims, and I write and whatnot. So a lot of people like contact me through DM, and they always ask me like how and what. And I'm like, I'm still trying to figure that out myself. So like with that said, it's hard because I have to tell them the reality. Like, I don't know your experience, but this is mine. And these are the expectations. So if this is really what you want, be prepared. And I don't feel like that practical part is set. So in terms of my positioning, it's always trying to do as much as I can, whether it's writing, I had the honor of like writing a cover story for Culture magazine recently, or writing for different academic databases, participating in different curatorial ventures like the Willie Smith Street Culture exhibition at Cooper Hewitt, or helping and collaborating with like our friend Kimberly Jenkins on the Fashion Arrays database, like doing everything that I can so that my resume is in a place that I know that when that time comes, job opportunity comes, it won't be any question about experience in terms of attaining what I feel that is my talent.
Thanks, Darnell. I do feel that, it's hard as a student entering a field, any field, but this field especially, to kind of know what's on the other end. And so those expectations are always really important. Would anyone else like to weigh in?
Can I ask, Darnell, can I ask a question? So, because I think you bring up a really critical point. And so, for example, at this museum, and I worked at bigger museums, but it's sort of the same thing. Budget's always an issue. And so the way in which we've been able recently to really diversify who's curating is with guest curators. But you can't make a living that way. And I know a lot of, you know, sort of one of the frustrating things is how, especially those of us who are smaller and mid-size, again, sometimes it comes down to money, because I think the desire is there, but we, you know, to have you guest curate an exhibition be fantastic. And, you know, you're building your resume, and you and other people, that's a way in which, again, I think sooner rather than later, we can start to change the dynamic of what these collections and acquisitions look like. But that's not a full-time gig. And I think that's one of the problems with the museum industry, is that you're right, it's locked out diverse voices because of some ways the financial model. I guess my question is, can we change the financial model?
I do feel like we can change the financial model, because I think I feel that is a bit lost in the fashion studies and in the academic field in general, is that I feel that, like, most individuals don't feel like they can have an entrepreneurial mind. Those two things can exist. Like, I can be an academic and also be an entrepreneur. And I think that we kind of segment those two things because we don't want to dilute the research, or we don't want to dilute the way we see the world in our, you know, very academic perspectives. But I think the two can exist. And when you think, I think generally, if we think creatively about what kind of projects we're procuring, that and what audiences they touch, I think that at that point you begin to see the numbers, and then then that will lead to asking for sponsors to say, this is what we're able to do. This is based on our last project. Can we do another similar project, but then increase the budget? Like, those different, I think that one thing leads to another, like a domino effect happens, but I think it starts with what is the output, and starting with who are we trying to reach? And then I think that's when you can kind of create a foundation, almost essentially like building a resume. When you have a resume that speaks to, you know, diverse output, then you can quantify and qualify to different corporate sponsors who will probably be more than willing, especially in this time where many of them are probably very quick to be like, oh, diverse, we need to throw money at it because we don't want to be the next company that's in cancel culture. You know, like, they're ready to do it, but it has to be the right kind of project for them to see and feel that they're giving their money to that right space. If you're doing, like I mentioned, what Grace Jones and Azadine Alaya as an exhibition. Don't nobody out there, if I see that exhibition, I sit there first. But like, if there's an exhibition like that that's out there, I mean, who knows that, you know, LVMH would be like, oh, wow, that's something that we can throw our money behind because we haven't seen it, and it's something that is new, and it touches so many different people. So we just have to be creative about the ideas and concept, and I know that the budgets will come. That's how I feel about it.
Thank you. For Susan, this is a really interesting question. Often overlooked and ignored topics are addressed through special topic exhibitions. Do you think that it's more effective to have these special topic exhibitions, or to normalize diverse narratives within all or most exhibitions? And where's that balance?
I do think it's an interesting question, and I think it's one of those things where we really have to have both of those kinds of exhibitions. There are gained in either approach, and I think that a meaningful and balanced exhibition program and programs, you know, across multiple institutions and even the country, can really be beneficial for all of us. When we are doing a rather typical survey, like I did when I was in Atlanta, a show called Gone with the Girdle, Freedom, Restraint, and Power in Women's Dress, I looked at that collection, which was, of course, formed by affluent white society as a historical society, like so many institutions around the country. And there were certain stories that were pretty easy to tell, but there are a lot of stories that weren't evident. And so what I was trying to do at that time was look around the city and saying, oh, where's a surprising woman who's breaking the glass ceiling? And I find Mayor Shirley Franklin, and she's African American. And so an extraordinary person to put in a position of power. Where are the sort of everyday people like the waitresses and the housekeepers, and looking for ways to tell those stories, to represent and fill in the blanks, to offset the strengths of the collection, so that whomever might come in the door could see themselves or their family members or their friends and that type of thing. And I also, just in that show, tried to put together, I included a lot of images of women, not only to show and together to show how they relate to one another and how the dress isn't just a certain type of dress or silhouette and that kind of thing. Because of course, most of us like looking at a unique garment or a design, but in reality, those are all in the world in context. And so looking comparatively, I think, can be helpful. So I think that sort of inclusivity is absolutely vital. On the other hand, and perhaps because of the lack of representation in a lot of fashion exhibitions, there have been extraordinary shows recently that have been recognized by the Richard Martin Award from Costume Society, and that I think that they allow for a shared, they provide these broad and deep windows into subjects that then allow the rest of us to go ahead and be more inclusive on these other shows. And the two shows that right away came to mind when I started to think about this was the Contemporary Muslim Fashions exhibition that recently was mounted at the Divan, curated by Jill D'Alessandro and Laura Camerlengo. And I think something we can learn from them, and also from the Native Fashion Now, which was mounted by the Peabody Essex, I want to say perhaps 4 years ago, is that we need to take risks, we need to collaborate, we need to build relationships, and we need to share authority. And if we do those things, then we will continue to have meaningful relationships beyond the road. I mean, there is that tendency when you're working on an exhibition to look for people to help you and then mount the show and then move on to the next thing and look for the new people to help you with that. And you've developed relationships, but then you've dropped these people. And that doesn't feel like a good way to be treated. And so I feel like really committing to these big, meaningful projects, learning from them. It's not going to go entirely smoothly, but building relationships, building trust, and changing who you are engaging with behind the scenes, and then in the public spaces when folks come into the exhibitions. So I think we have to do both, and we have to be strategic. Sometimes in planning, an opportunity almost presents itself and you didn't think you were going to go that way, but it makes great sense. And so we need to be flexible, we need to be nimble, and we need to be generous. To Darnell's point, I feel like the rise of museum studies programs was really exciting in a lot of ways, and opened people's eyes to potential opportunities that they didn't know existed before. When I went to Atlanta in the mid-90s, I was the only curator of costume and textiles in the state. And when my position was eliminated about 2012, I don't think another one was created. So obviously that's only one state, but there aren't many positions, and some people will find a way to land those jobs, but if it should be something that they go into willingly. And so I think a lot of us need to be supporting and advocating students all along the way to change how museums work and to make sure that we are representative of the people we claim we want to be working with.
That's such a good point. Would anyone else like to weigh in on special exhibitions versus kind of more permanent collections displays? Great. Well, we are going.
I just want to.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just want to put in, like, shout out to Laura. We just did because contemporary Muslim fashion is now Cooper Hewitt as well. It traveled to us, and we just did a great panel, Reshaping Modest Fashion, that I want everybody to point their direction to, which Laura did a wonderful job moderating. It's on our YouTube page as well. So I just want to kind of put that out there as like, that is like a great example of like what is, you know, what's possible and just kind of reimagining the landscape. So I'm right there with you, Susan.
So we have just a few more minutes. We're going to start taking questions at 3 o'clock, start answering them, but see other people have already started in the chat box, so please continue. I'm going to ask each one of our panelists, and Susan, you already mentioned a few, so you can pick up if you want to mention a few more. Can you just like give us examples of a fashion exhibition that was successful in communicating diverse perspectives?
I'll give a shout out in case Georgina and Liz are too modest, but I think that the Black Fashion Designer exhibition, FIT, it kind of pulled together and set a foundation in a way that was smart and open and something that we all continue to learn from and go back to. And I love that you're virtually then also having programming related to that. And then Body Beautiful, diversity. Georgina is, you know, I haven't seen it. I do sort of drool over little shots I get on an installation. It is just so smart. And this kind of thinking and not being afraid to put it out there with really rigorous scholarship as well as an openness. I mean, I think that's where there's this kind of, when you got that great balance. And I wanted to come up with something that was a little different. But I'm obsessed with Duro Olowu. And he did this incredible exhibition at the MCA in Chicago called Seeing Chicago, where he curated an exhibition of Chicago artists of color. That at one point, there's also some of his designs, and his latest show is inspired by artist Emma Amos, who recently passed away. And I think that kind of bringing in the different inspirations and having designers come in to different kinds of museums and mine their collections and what's going on that's the kind of energy and new insight that can only come from bringing in somebody who's not on staff all the time. As wonderful as your staff may be, but that's just a brilliant example.
I would mention Willie Smith because Darnell was involved, so probably can't. Obviously, that sadly had to close on the day that opened, but I do have the book, which I similarly, as to Sarah, like when you're not in the same country as an exhibition that you really want to see, it's great to have that kind of catalogue. But I think it's just so important because, unfortunately, given what a pivotal figure he was, he's just not really remembered in the way that he should be. And I think that's a huge chunk of our understanding of contemporary fashion is missing, because by introducing streetwear to contemporary fashion in the way that he did, he was kind of crossing those junctures of race, class, and gender and really democratizing fashion for people. And it was just coming back to that idea of, you know, you create your position in the world and you express your identity through dress. And I think that's so important that that's something that's told And the other one that came to mind for me actually is to go back to FIT, because I think they do this really well. But also it's a little bit different, but I was thinking about the Pink exhibition. And for me, that was so interesting because it just broke down this idea of cliches and received opinion on things. And so it wasn't just about gender stereotyping. I think looking at the idea of pink as being erotic because of its association with the tones of Caucasian skin inherently picks up on, racial bias. And the fact that it placed pink in a global context as well. So you were able to understand the meaning of this color to other cultures. I think it was a really clever way of taking something that you thought you knew about and just completely blowing it apart.
I think I'd also like to mention the Ebony Fashion Fair exhibition that Chicago History Museum mounted some years ago. Obviously, that magazine was based here in Chicago, and there was access to that extraordinary archive. And I think that it worked on several levels. Obviously, just exposing visitors to an incredible array of fashion, to those extraordinary shows, which were so important in the Black community, as those fashion fairs traveled about the country and helped raise money for local causes. And then also just to validate Black fashion, Black clientele, and to really look through a slightly different lens of this magazine at fashion and relationships with designers and so forth.
Those are all great. So I'm sure anyone in the audience wants to look them up. I'm sure they still have web presences that can be accessed. Sorry, Darnell, go ahead.
Oh, no. I was also thinking about what is Native American fashion now. What is it? I saw it when it traveled to the American Museum. What is it? National American Museum of American Museum of the National Indian. I always get the acronyms messed up. But it was the location. Oh, go ahead.
It was National Museum of American Indian in New York.
There you go. Yes, National Museum of American Indian here in New York when it came. And that was actually the first time I saw an exhibition like that where it was outside even purview of even what I knew and understood, what indigenous designers, their creativity. So I totally celebrate it. I actually have the catalog. It's everything to me. But between that, the Stephen Burroughs exhibition that happened at the Museum of the City of New York several years ago, I think is like a great example of that and how they very much centered Stephen Burroughs' life in New York City, which I think that is even great because it allows for other exhibitions to be executed on him that talk about other aspects of his design, and other facets of who he was as a designer. And certainly a lot of the exhibitions at the museum at FIT, as a museum at FIT alum, as an FIT alum, that was my go-to every year. From the exhibition about the body, even the Black fashion designer exhibition, of course, and so many others. And then I also remember going to Amsterdam. There was a traveling exhibition called Fashion Cities, and it was about all the growing, emerging fashion cities in Africa: Johannesburg, Lagos. I forgot the other two cities that they did. I think it was Morocco and one other that they were exploring all of the emerging designers from those areas, which I think is like great in terms of like expanding how we see other designers beyond the European and American context. So I thought that was pretty dope as well. And also like Africa print fashion now as well. I think that was also another exhibition. I went to it when it was touring, I believe, in Memphis. So yeah, pretty dope. I think there are great examples that are out there that we can build upon.
Thank you. I just quickly want to mention an exhibition, and I don't remember the name. If anyone knows, please type it into the chat box, at the Jewish Museum, that looked at Jewish dress throughout the Mideast in, I think going back several hundred years, and it was a really surprising and informative exhibition, and maybe not one that was like classified as fashion, but one that I found really enlightening. But I'm going to switch over and take some questions. So let's see, I'll start with Sandy. Sandy wants to know about looking backwards to see what has been missed in the timeline of global fashion history. So however you want to interpret that, maybe how one looks backwards, or kind of ways that you've successfully done this. Whoever would like to jump in.
Well, I mean, I looked at it from a place of my own heritage, I guess. Like, I guess that's just my place, but obviously for those who obviously aren't Black, like how would you look into that other histories, other marginalized histories? And I think that, I don't know, I like to do things in a very fun way. Like, I don't like to feel like what I do is work. I want it to feel like it's just an extension of the joy that I have, you know? Like, for me, one of my biggest areas of my personal research is understanding how Beyonce uses her on stage costumes and fashions to delineate the messages in her music. So for me, it's also like looking through like the lens of this like fashion icon who touches so many different aspects of the history of fashion and art history. So I feel like even through like looking at different figures who are, you know, beyond that pure whiteness and that are from marginalized spaces, I think can open a larger door. So that's just my thing. Like I don't think it's anything wrong with looking at entertainers, because many of them are fashion figures in the 20th and 21st century, is equally important as someone like Marie Antoinette during the 18th century. So I think that was my way. So
I would also say that museum collections generally are, I mean, we represent really one kind of clothing. And if you thinking just about the Body Beautiful exhibition and what we were looking at as lacking in terms of representation in the fashion industry, that actually goes back through time as well. So museum collections tend to collect dress that, you know, was the dress of non-disabled people, for example. We don't, as a rule, tend to collect adaptive design or to even consider, from working with Sinead Burke for the exhibition, I remember her telling me about how often when we try to be inclusive of disability, we tend to look at like adaptive design, for example, as through a medical lens and a sympathetic lens, rather than through this idea of fashion and this idea that they still want to participate in fashion. And Sinead herself is a perfect role model for that, and she advocates for that within the fashion industry. But the same thing goes for size as well. So when we look at fashion history, we have this idea of everybody being just this one body shape, because we take this stereotype, like stereotypical ideal, you know, so everybody was in the crinoline and then the bustle and they all had a tiny waist and this and that. And while yes, they had the undergarments that created a certain shape and a certain curve or whatever, not everybody would have actually looked identical. And I think when we do a kind of sweeping history of fashion, it's very top level, it's very shallow, and you can really dig deeper, I think, in every decade into all of those like various kind of representations of people.
So a question from Laura is directed at Sarah. As a director, could you talk more about how museum financial models could be changed to prioritize staff compensation, especially for well-paid, not just paid, internships that bring candidates that are more diverse into the pipeline?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, well, you know, when I asked the question to Darnell and he said, you know, in terms of exhibitions about sponsorship, which is, it's true. I mean, there is some truth to that, but I think in terms of long-term sustainable dollars, look, the model we've worked on is this balance of, if you have 4 legs of a stool and you've got endowment income, earned revenue, corporation and individual support, and if you're 25% of all of that, which is like a very healthy thing to be. If one of them goes south, you can still do that. And the reason I talk about that is because it is about the kinds of dollars that are needed to really invest. And I think museums have to, and my understanding, I have a new colleague who's from, the head of the fashion school is from Dundee, Scotland, and she's kind of, I think, horrified that the first thing we cut in a budget is professional development support. So I think that if you're in a position of leadership, your job is to fight for the dollars that will reprioritize. And that is a very hard thing to say in this time when we've all had our budgets cut. But there is nothing more valuable than your staff and diverse staff. And if we don't get the new voices in now and support that and to have that professional development, we're not going to go anywhere. So I think it is, I came in and I thought, okay, we usually keep our exhibitions up longer. I'm like, we can turn our exhibitions around more quickly. Now I'm not in a position to do that, but I'd rather like save the money and figure out how to support these kind of more inclusive programming and exhibitions through supporting people. So that is a rambling answer that does not have a succinct response, because everybody's a little different. And if you don't, it's like being honest and saying you're not neutral. If you're in a leadership position and you don't fight for it, it's not going to happen. And that's the best answer I have right now.
If I could follow up, Sarah, I'm not in a position with as much authority or perhaps as many sleepless nights as you have, and so that's not all bad. But I think, especially at this moment when so many of our institutions are either committing or recommitting to diversity, equity, access, inclusion, that it's really imperative that at every opportunity throughout planning a project or throughout budgeting or throughout whatever other examples, that we consider, do we have everyone at the table? Are we working toward this, not just in our diversity bucket over here, to quote our brand new director, who just started at our institution a few weeks ago, but to really commit. And if we continue to ask those questions and ask for the money and ask for these things, it demonstrates the need. And I don't think it's going to happen overnight, but I do think that with time, we will be able to reallocate some resources. And that the more opportunities for meaningful engagement that we're giving the public, the more that can lead to support, corporate support, sponsorship, and some of those funding that perhaps aren't coming in the way that we think they could.
No, that terrific point. One of the points that I wanted to bring up today was that, at least in this country, over the last couple of years, leadership in museums is shifting. This happens every 10 years or so as the older directors age out and retire. And what is happening, and I know from colleagues who are in AAMD, and that in about the last 4 years, new leadership that are millennials, well, older millennials and Gen Xers are coming into these leadership roles. They come from much more diverse communities. They have very different mindsets than the old guard. And I think that some of these necessary changes are going to start to move along quicker, just because we've got a different generation coming in. And some of us who are, a little long in the tooth, I feel my job is to get us to a point where that next millennial Gen Xer director coming in will then be able to sail. But I think the big change will happen when we have more leadership change generationally.
Thank you. Sometimes, it's really hard for audience members and also people who are not directors to kind of envision those issues. So it's great to hear kind of about how the sausage is made. Janine made a comment. She says, at her institution, we have adopted a mandate to include multiple non-white, non-males, and it's been successful. So what are your comments and ideas on kind of institutional mandates as parameters to kind of create diversity?
I think that it's case by case, right? Like I think that on a very broad scale, it really, I'm not sure if that works for every institution to put such a specific, I don't know if it does or doesn't. I think it's positive in some cases, depending on what those parameters are. I think that based off of like the example that you gave from the question, I mean, non-white and non-male, I think that is, you know, good in a sense because you are bringing in other marginalized groups, obviously particularly female, but then also we're also in this world where gender constructs are playing into play, and that also like rings in my mind, like what male, female, you know, what does that trans, like what are we, like I don't know if that particular mandate is specific enough. I think it's just kind of like a band-aid. So I think that something like that for myself, I believe that, you know, mandates are great for a very temporary time, but like we have to make sure that everything is baked in terms of how you in other different experiences into the fold. So that's how I don't, that's how I feel. Like it's just like I don't believe in band-aids, you know. I just believe in just making sure and ensuring that you just have a culture and building a culture that for diversity across board, no matter color, race, age, and those bylaws that are within, you know, a charter of an institution. So that's how I see it.
Could I add something?
Yeah.
May I add something?
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I apologize for stepping over you there, but I think, Darnell, we lost you for a while in there, and unfortunately your eloquence was kind of folded over itself, but I think we got the gist. Oh, I've lost my train of thought.
Oh, sorry.
No, it wasn't you. To the point of whether these mandates are inherently good or necessary, and I feel like my ideal self would say, no, we don't need them at all. But in the short term, I think that for those people who are interested and willing to fight the fight, you know, who's already at the table and can help to fight the fight, that it's great to have that tool to remind people of, to help change the projects that get greenlit and to help us commit to more equity in the ranks and all of that. So I think that for now, in some cases, not all, of course, that they can really work for everyone's benefit.
And I'll add that Janine, kind of in her longer statement, said, you know, there was a little bit of pushback from this at first because, of course, it means more work for curators, and you know, many curators are overworked. But that, as this policy was enacted, that people really became excited about the new stories that they could tell. Faith has a question, a comment on not only just looking at different groups, for example, African Americans or Latinx communities or Asian Pacific communities as a whole, but also thinking about how class operates. And I would argue kind of in mainstream societies as well, as how do we diversify when it comes to depicting different classes. I know from my experience that sometimes these objects are not as readily available as, you know, the really high-end ones that were preserved, but I'd love to hear other people's perspectives on that.
I think in historic dress collections, it's exactly as you say. And we have in our collection comparatively little what we would have called working class dress at the time. But it tends to be those areas of the collection that we research the most, actually, because it is actually the most interesting. So I remember going to, in this country, the Dress and Textile Specialist Conference, and someone presented a paper around one white shirt. And it was the story of this white shirt who belonged to this, you know, relatively, I mean, I can't remember what his occupation was, but, you know, a working class gentleman at the time, and it was a shirt that would have been repaired and, you know, would have had this whole life, and they basically unpicked the whole life through the stains on the shirt and the darning on the shirt, and it was the most interesting conference presentation I think I've ever heard. But on the paper, on the agenda, it didn't sound like a whole lot, and it wasn't the one I was excited to hear about. And I think that is actually a huge issue, and I think particularly when we're talking about the issues that we're talking about today, like my current research is very much engaging with intersectionality, and there are obviously junctures very much between like race and class, for example. I mean, Darnell's kind of touched on it. Renee Edo-Lodge's book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, which is very much about British culture, but she touches on that a lot, and I think she has a whole chapter dedicated to it. And so I think class, you know, thinking about class is really important. When we think about it sometimes in terms of some subculture, subcultural dress and trends and so on, but I think we have to think about it more broadly across all of these things and across this span of our collections as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And for us, as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, sort of my initial experiences with the students here at Kent State and taking them through the fashion timeline and the questions that come up about the fancy ladies' clothes from the, you know, 1760s and the 18, and they don't, and not seeing themselves and what that means. I think that kind of research, and even if you don't have in your collection, being able to talk about it in a way based on who your audience is. And I think a lot of this is us trying to be really, really intentional about, if we don't build these strong connections with this community, the people that love fashion are, God love you, I hope you keep coming. But because these are discussions and meetings that can have an impact on these kids. And the last thing I want is for them to walk through and feel this doesn't have any relationship to me because I, you know, grew up on a farm, and that's what we have to work really hard to sort of change. So it's that relationship to audience for us.
Great. We have a question from Sandy, and this kind of segues from the last question, is what type of items are you focusing on to add to your collections?
Should I jump in then? Something I'm really keen on is a kind of legacy from our Body Beautiful exhibition. So doing that exhibition really made me aware of what we don't have in our collection, as it involved largely loans and some new acquisitions. But from that, my research has kind of followed through the photographer Campbell Addy and the fashion editor Ibrahim Kamara, and looking at their work, and I've been exploring Black masculinities. And we'd already identified menswear as a weak area of our collection in terms of the kind of post-1900 collections. And for me, I think it's a particularly interesting area to explore in terms of collecting, because I'd like us to expand to, you know, consider LGBTQ histories, to consider, we do not have very many Black designers in our collection at all. And it's something if we should be looking at, and I think it's really interesting, particularly to consider that in terms of menswear, to bring all those factors together for me. I And I think particularly in times of limited budgets, when we're trying to justify acquisitions that we're making as organizations, it's finding objects that you can tell stories from, and that you can tell diverse stories from.
Yeah, we're, you know, I've been in the 2.5 years I've been here, because of my background interest in contemporary culture, material culture. And so, you know, looking at in the 21st century, our collection really falls off after 2006 or 7. And, you know, it's one thing we know what we need to be doing. And we don't have designers of color. We don't have a lot of menswear or gender neutral. And we've got, you know, I'm looking at pockets where we've got great Rudy Gernrich. And so how do we continue those traditions? Like, what are the threads that we can sew? But the curator and I are not going to do that ourselves. And so there's been this, I feel I've got a little bit of money. I want to make sure we're adding artists, designers of color, that there are conversations and relevancy. And I'm also thinking about for the students that are here today, as well as in 10 years, who are they going to be looking back to? So then we start to talk about streetwear, and, you know, where are the connections there? So it's a work in progress, that we've got a commitment, but I got to bring, as Susan said, you know, having the right people at the table, to make sure that it's not, you know, the old system of the same people making decisions.
Can I just follow up from that, actually? And it's something that we've been thinking about a lot lately, is if we're trying to pinpoint things that we want to acquire, you know, it does come back to the same idea, because a lot of acquisitions come down to curators' interests, or I think someone's already pointed out exhibitions that have happened in the past, and it can be a slightly strange collecting journey that an organization goes on. But for me, like, our next exhibition's on the little black dress, and I'd really like us to look at the notion of black and blackness as well. So to not just consider this as this very Western fashion phenomenon, but to consider the meaning of the color in terms of protest and politics and so on and so forth. But in order to do that, I don't think I'm the right person to, you know, pinpoint acquisitions. I think I can do, and I should do, work around this, and, you know, I need to do my own research, but I also need to get someone to come in to join me to kind of guest curate, but also not just guest curate that section of an exhibition, but to also have input into what we are collecting.
Great. So we have just a couple of minutes left, just about 3 minutes. So perhaps one or more of you could address Laura's question. She said that she really appreciated the mention earlier about how Western dress is able to be fashion, while non-Western dress is often treated as static and then changing. I would love to hear your thoughts on ways to combat this notion in the future.
I think that a primary way to kind of combat this is to, well, first it has to be an introspective, and I hate to get all deep on everybody, but I think it should be like an introspective approach, right? You have to look at yourself with outside of your own experience, your own privilege, your own like purview of the world before you're able to kind of like expand your mind beyond what you have been used to understanding. So like it has to be like that internal work has to kind of be done first, I think, before you kind of get to the actual like practical side of like then using now like that introspection to now look at, you know, a collection and say, well, how am I going to then, you know, how am I going to include and encompass all of these different perspectives within a collection or within the whatever exhibition or research output that you're going to embark on. And I think that when we begin to do the work in dismantling and deconstructing these concepts that are very just ingrained in the whole kind of museum structure of like centering the West. I think that, and also just actively just kind of doing the work to be well learned about these projects, because where I come from, we always say like we have to learn our history and your history. And for a lot of people that are white, they didn't have to learn about other people's histories or experiences. That's just the reality of our education system in this here and in Europe. So I think that, with that said, we have to kind of do the work of just the groundwork of just understanding others' perspectives and marginalized perspectives within this side of the world. And then from there, I think you begin to construct, expand the view of what is fashion, even beyond what we've been taught of, fashion being a Western concept. And then from there, a domino effect of, okay, well, if it's not within that Western perspective, how can we categorize this as fashion or contextualize it as fashion and in different forms of dress? So I just think it's not a easy fix. It's not going to be, we snap our fingers and everything is fashion. It's going to be a long journey. It's a marathon in terms of just dismantling and deconstructing what our institutions have been built on for hundreds of years at this point in time. So that's how I see it.
I think the leadership is always seen through the eyes of artists and designers. And I think, part of the answer to that question is supporting and seeing what people, there was just before this, talking about the new designers, and Sandiso Kumalo, I wrote her name down, who just did a new collection, and sort of taking inspiration and having people bring other designers and artists, taking cultures that are their cultures and interpreting them through their clothing. And in many ways, that's some of the best way in which we can see pathways to open up that what has been that ghettoization.
Great. I'd just like to thank everyone on our panel for having this discussion today, and I'm going to turn it back over to Monica, and I think she has some closing words before we end our panel.
Hi, well, again, I'm Monica Sklar, the VP of Tech for CSA, and your host for today. I'm actually in my office, and literally right behind me was the Ebony Fashion Fair exhibition book, because it was so good. So I thought I'd grab it. And if anyone's in Georgia, you can come see this in my office. And I also grabbed, because so many people mentioned street style exhibitions. This was a 1994 exhibition in the UK by Ted Polhemus about street style. And this is the book that I got and read and realized that this could be a career. So I'm sitting in this chair because of this book, which was from an exhibition about people that don't usually get covered in exhibitions. So with that, I have many other books if you're in Georgia and want to come and see about all of these wonderful exhibitions. Once again, we would like to thank today's speakers for their time and efforts. We'd also like to thank all of you who attended. We'd like to thank the organizers who collaborated, especially our moderator, Elizabeth Way from FIT, Costume Society of America board member, Graham Witzberger, who organizes all of our virtual content, the VP of Education, Sarah Woodyard, VP of External, who handles our PR, Adam McFarland, and the CSA office, who we could do nothing without, which are Kate Ahn and Kristen Miller-Zone, who is the executive director. This panel was recorded, will be put on YouTube. It will be free and open to anyone who wants to view it. Please consider our next virtual event, which is with Leon Weavers, while he hosts Dress and Drinks. It's a webinar this Wednesday, the 30th at 7. He'll be joined by guest David Meyer II to learn about his journey from visiting art teacher to assistant curator at the South Dakota Atka Lakota Museum and Cultural Center. Please follow the Costume Society of America on Facebook, on Instagram. We're going to be doing lots more conversations on dress all year round. And also, if you're able, please do consider donating a little bit on CSA's website. It will go directly to helping support this kind of programming, and we hope to bring you more of it. Thank you all for your time today.